Hello everyone and welcome to this new video of Everyday JavaScript. In this video we are going to learn the new features that are provided in Promise APIs. We all know what promises are, but just in case if you don't know what Promise is a way we write our asynchronous code in our JavaScript in a much cleaner fashion. It helps us work with asynchronous code and helps us handle the success and error scenarios when a certain promise is resolved or rejected. There might be a scenario where we may have to work with multiple promises at the same time. For example, a web page needs to make multiple API calls simultaneously in order to display an information. So, in order to work with multiple promises at the same time, the promise object had provided us with certain functions which helped us aggregate the results of multiple promises at one place. Such functions were all and race. Now, there are two more functions that have been introduced in the Promise APIs, all settled and any. Let's get started with what those things are.
Before I start this video, please like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. And also don't forget to comment in the comment section. Thank you.
So as we all know, the Promise API provides us with four functions, all, race, all settled, and any. Now there's one common thing between all these four API functions. They take in multiple promises as an input. So you have to pass an array of promises to these functions. The second common thing is they return a single promise. So whenever you execute this function, it returns a single promise which then either resolves or rejects based on the definition of these API functions. So let's go and check the definition of all the Promise API functions. We'll start with Promise.all. Promise.all, the promise that is returned from this function gets resolved when all the promises are resolved or any one of the promises rejected. I want you to pay attention to the words that are bold over here. They carry an important meaning in the definition. So, the promise returned by the Promise.all function gets resolved when all the promises are resolved, or it gets rejected when any one of the promise in the list is rejected. The second definition we have is Promise.race. As the name suggests, it's a race. Now, if we pass multiple promises to this function, the output of this would be the first promise that gets resolved in an array, or it would get rejected by the first promise that is rejected. I mean the fastest one. The third one, the new feature that we have is Promise.all.settled. All settled means when all promises are either resolved or rejected. That's it. It's the simplest one. This function returns a promise which gets resolved when all the promises that are passed to this function are either resolved or rejected. The fourth one that we have, Promise.any, is an experimental one. So you won't find it anywhere. Your editors won't support it, your browsers won't support it because it's not yet approved by the committee. The fourth one is Promise.any. It is basically just the opposite of Promise.all, where it resolves whenever the first promise of the list gets resolved or all of the promises are rejected. So these are the definitions. Let's start coding. I'll take you to the example file and we'll start coding over there all the scenarios. So I am here and we'll check how Promise APIs work. I'll start with Promise.all. So let me go ahead and start and write the promises. We create a promise by using new promise. The promise takes a callback function which is known as the executor. The executor takes two parameters, the resolve and reject. Now What we are going to do is we are going to use set timeout, and we are going to say it will resolve after 500 milliseconds. We are going to say resolve promise one resolve. Let me copy paste this. Promise to resolve, and it will take 100 milliseconds. Let me take this and copy paste it. Promise 3 is resolved, and it will take something 300 milliseconds. Now what you have seen over here is I've created three promises. The first promise gets resolved in 500 milliseconds, the second promise gets resolved in 100 milliseconds, and the third one gets resolved in 300 milliseconds. So if I were to see the fastest promise in order of ascending, it would be promise 2, promise 3, and promise 1. Promise 2 being the fastest and promise 1 being the slowest. Now let's assume that our page requires the resolution of all these promises in order to display some data. In order to do that, we'll need to use Promise API Promise.all. Let's use that. I'll use Promise.all and I'll pass an array which will contain promise 1, promise 2, promise 3. I've passed all these three promises inside this function. Now, as I said that all these promise APIs return a promise. So that means that I'll have access to .then function. So this then function would contain the response. Let me log the response. Now let's go ahead and check what will be the output of this function. When I execute this, I'll get an aggregated response of all the three promises: promise 1, promise 2, promise 3. Now if we go back to the definition of Promise.all, it will resolve when all the promises are resolved. So once all the promises are resolved, that is after 500 milliseconds, this would have been resolved, this would have been resolved, and this would have been resolved. I would get the aggregated response of promise 1, promise 2, promise 3, whatever the resolution value is. Now let's go ahead and check the failure part. I've copied the code over here so we don't waste the time, and let's reject one of the APIs. Now let's go ahead and check the definition. If any one of the promise out of the lot is rejected, the promise will go into the reject state. So let's try and reject the 300 millisecond one. I'll say rejected, promise 3 is rejected. So just see over here, the promise 3 is the one that is getting rejected. So in order to handle that, I'll just use .catch. It's not formatted properly. Error. This error would be the rejection value of the third promise, because our definition was the promise that is returned by Promise.all will be rejected if any one of the promises is rejected. So let's go ahead and give it a try. Promise 3 rejected. So this is how Promise.all works. Now let's jump to Promise.race, the second API that we have. Now let me copy the code that we had, entire code over here, to Promise.race so we don't waste time. Now again, all the three promises are resolved over here. all the three promises are resolved. But the fastest one is Promise.to, and we are going to use Promise.race. The definition of Promise.race is first promise to be resolved or rejected. By first, I mean the fastest. So, if the promise which is getting resolved or rejected first will be the resolution or rejection value of this promise. So, let's go ahead and try Promise.race. I've given the three promises over here. The fastest promise is Promise.to, so we should expect the response to be Promise.to resolved. So let's go ahead and check the output of this. I'll go ahead and keep it at the top. Promise race success. We are getting promise to resolve because it was the fastest promise to get resolved. So this is a very useful in fastest API to be called. Let's see the error scenario where any of the promise where the fastest promise is getting rejected. So I'll go to promise.race.failure and I'll go ahead and reject the fastest promise, and we are not going to get the output in .then because the promise is going to be rejected, so we are going to get the error in catch. So the expected output of this promise.race with a given set of promises is the first or the fastest promise to be rejected, and in our case it's Promise.to. So the output should be Promise.to.rejected with the error function. Let me highlight it by adding an error text over here. So we'll see error in front of the output. Let's try. Error promise to rejected. So it comes in a catch block if the fastest promise is rejected. Let's come to the third API function, that is allSettled. Let me copy the code so that we don't waste time. So here we are. We have three promises. Again, all of them are getting resolved. And let's say all settled. Now, the definition of Promise.all.settled is, let's write the definition so that it's clear. When all of the promises are resolved or rejected. So all the promises need to be resolved or rejected, and the aggregation happens inside this. In order to show you more clearly, let me increase the time of the first promise to, let's say, 3 seconds. Now, after 3 seconds, you will see an aggregation of these three results. So let's go ahead and try. Node all settled promise success. And after 3 seconds, we'll get the output of all the three promises as an object along with the status of each and every promises. So this is particularly useful. So let's say your web page, in order to display certain data, you need 5 API calls, and your requirement is I don't need to show anything on my web page, or I need to show a loading spinner continuously on my web page until and unless all the API calls have been successful. So after all the API calls have been successful, at the end, you're going to decide whether the promises are fulfilled or rejected. So this object can be particularly useful where you get to know whether the status of the promise is success or rejected, and you get the value of the promise. Now let's try the failure scenario because we want to. I have copied the code as it is because we need to save time, and we are going to reject the two promises. We're going to reject the two promises. We're going to say these two promises are rejected. Now the response should be an array of objects which contains status of all the three promises, with the promise 2 and promise 3 being error or rejected status. So let's go ahead and see that. Yes, we now have promise 1 which is fulfilled after 3 seconds, but the promise 2 and promise 3 were rejected. So we get the same thing. Notice that we are going to get everything aggregated inside the then function. We won't have the catch error even if the promise is rejected over here. So this is success and error scenario of all settled. The fourth one, which will not work over here, I need to show it, but we cannot execute it. The reason being is it is yet to be finalized. It is Promise.any. So we can't do anything about it. And the fourth and the final one that we have in the API list of promise is Promise.any. Unfortunately, any cannot be demonstrated. The reason is currently it is still on stage 3 of TC39 committee recommendation. So it is not yet pushed to any browser or any IDE. So you will get an error that it's an unresolved function or a method. If you want, you can check out the definition of Promise.any on MDN, which is the favorite tool for me for documentation reference, and you will get the details about this thing, Promise.any. Now the only thing that I need to show is what shall be the output of Promise.any. So right now we have three promises which get resolved at three different times. Promise 2 being the fastest, Promise 3 being the second fastest, and Promise 1 being the slowest. The response of this Promise.any is first promise to be resolved. So in our case, Promise 2 gets resolved over here. In the failure scenario of Promise.any, we'll have to add a catch. Now this will be logged out only if all of our promises, please pay attention, only if all of our promises are rejected. And that means that it will give us an aggregation of errors of all the promises that we have. A pretty edge case scenario, but certainly a useful one for web pages. So that's pretty much it from all the promise functions. So we are having four promise functions: Promise.all, Promise.race, Promise.allSettled, and Promise.any. So I hope you liked my video, and please do like, subscribe, and comment in the comment section, and share this video with your friends who are having any confusion with promises or promise APIs. So this is one of the new features in JavaScript. I hope I hope to see you soon, and please do interact in the comment section. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this video. For more videos like this, please like, subscribe, and share my channel Everyday JavaScript. And for any other concepts that you want me to explain visually, please drop your comments in the comments section. And thank you for watching.